Welcome to Seeing This. I'm Mike Ornelas, and today I'm happy to be joined by director Michael Premo, whose latest film, Homegrown, is a documentary providing an intense look at the fermentation of frustration that led to January 6th and the attacks on the Capitol, and what pardons signal culturally and politically for the future of democracy in the United States. The documentary is available exclusively at homegrown.film, so make sure to check that out. Michael Premo, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Congratulations on the film. Very stirring, emotionally documentary. You know, you capture very intimate footage of participants of January 6th, months prior to the event from a very nonpartisan perspective. I'm curious, what was your concept of your documentary when you first got started? And did you anticipate it going in the direction that it did?
That's a great question. We started this film. The idea for this film first kind of started bubbling in our mind around 2016, 2017. There was this, as you remember, this sort of widening chasm. This sort of the temperature was sort of being sort of ratcheted up, and we were surprised by how surprised people were about the rise of Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
For me and for many folks, he feels like such a perfect distillation of everything America pretends that it's not. And so there was just this, I was fascinated by the dissonance that was happening between people's sort of disbelief that someone like Donald Trump could happen and what the reality of this country is. And so we really wanted to sort of spend time with people to better understand why people were so incensed and frustrated about everything that was happening in this moment and what was driving them into the streets away from their keyboards. And so we wanted to know who these people are, what they're fighting for, and what they wanted, what their vision for America was. And, we were particularly interested in the sort of subset of those people who felt like violence might be the only option to solve their political problems. And that question, what are you doing and why is violence an option for you, really drove our investigation and informed the type of people we were trying to understand or spend time with, and where we sort of went in the country. And we ended up sort of filming with about a dozen people across the country. We could see that something was building, something was bubbling. There was this alignment happening, particularly in the conservative movement, that was building this sort of social movement into this really vibrant mass movement that was bringing together all different segments of the conservative movement and having them sort of be in one place around one vision in a way that I had never seen, and I'm not sure has ever quite happened in this country. And so we knew that something was going to happen. We, of course, had no idea what was going to happen, did happen, but we knew that things were bubbling to a point that it was going to pop eventually.
It's bound to be something to capture, historical to say the least. And how did you go about identifying these individuals that you end up kind of following throughout the course of months and ultimately years? Is that something that they were it seemed as if they were quite ready and willing to give you that exposure? Was that the case? How did you find these people?
So we found these people by going to rallies, going to events, going to meetups, going to meetings of sort of activist groups. And the people who sort of made the final film kind of were people that we felt were broadly representative of the type of people that we had interacted with over the 5, 6, 7 years of making this film.
Wow.
So, for example, like Chris, one person who's in the film, he is somebody who was never political, as he described before 2016. He, before Trump sort of like emerged as a candidate, he said that he never really paid attention to politics, but there was just something about Trump that spoke to him, his anxieties. And so he sort of leapt into the fight, so to speak. Randy is somebody who's that sort of behind the scene organizer who represents the backbone of any social movement, who's like really doing that hard work to like get people to meetings and bring people out and share information and help people, different causes within the movement, raise money to support its growth and development. And then Thad Thad is an individual who is represents this increasing multicultural diversity that's present in the conservative movement. That before the 20 what year is it 20 the 20 the before the election last year, the 2024 election, the hadn't really been talked about. This sort of increasing participation of Black and Latino folks wasn't really sort of noticed as much. And so, but we everywhere we went, we met Black and Latino folks, and so we were like, no, we need to include this in the film. And that really informed how we made those sort of tough decisions around who would be in the film and not be
Mm.
in the film. Also, from like a filmmaking cinematic perspective, the people in the final film had to sort of interact on some level. They had to like be at the same events or have some level of interaction for it to really kind of for the narrative to cohere. And it was different. Getting access to these folks was different for all sorts of folks. Like Thad was somebody who he got his whole chapter in this Proud Boy chapter in Salt Lake City involved in the process of vetting and digging into me and doing all these a bunch of these little interviews that we did to sort of vet me and see if I was on the up and up before they were like, yeah, come ride with us.
Right, right. I can imagine that must have been a difficult line to navigate as far as building enough trust so these folks will allow you to document them. And also, whatever they may be, you being true to your own beliefs or political background or whatever the case may be. But one thing that was certain is there's a lot of frustration and misguided energy on the ground in a lot of the events and protests that you capture. As a filmmaker, can you talk about what it was like for you and your crew on the ground? What was the energy that you guys experienced, and what were the conversations like at the end of the day after capturing what you just witnessed?
So it's so crazy, and this might sound even crazier, but like the energy at most of the places that we went to, or most of the sort of public events we went to, of course, being in people's homes was very different. But
Right.
the public events we went to, it was like a giant tailgate party. Like that was like a tailgate frat party. Like you didn't know if a fight was going to break out at any moment, or being at like a hip hop club in the '90s in New York. Like there was just like
Sure.
this like energy was just like at 100, and like at any moment something was going to pop off, and that energy was like often like carnival, like party, like tailgate, like it was electric. But also there was this sort of like because the grievances were so explicitly voiced again and again, the sort of frustration was so palpable, and that it seemed like things were regularly about to pop off. Whether or not they did or not, there was always that energy. So it was a
Mm.
really interesting experience to be at these events. And I never thought I'd make a movie in America where we'd have to rock like bulletproof vests and ballistic helmets and stuff just in case.
Terrifying to say the least, especially when you're trying to make an important document and creative document as well, and think your life might be at risk, especially in this kind of environment. And in regards to creativity, you've made the decision to focus specifically on, the Proud Boys, the Trump supporters, with limited counter perspective. We do see a moment where I think it's Thad that's trying to bring in the Black Lives Matter and its representatives. What was that focus and effort to not dilute that perspective of the conservative side, the extreme conservative side, and show it for what it was? What was kind of your thought process when you approached that?
For including sort of Thad's work with Black Lives Matter, is that?
Yeah, well, as far as including his work, but that kind of being the only capacity that we see any kind of real counter. I mean, even to say counter is kind of maybe a strong word, but your focus is very much on this group of people, and
Mhm.
I can understand why. But I'm just curious from your own words, what was your reasoning for focusing specifically on this group without any kind of counter
Oh yeah.
perspective?
Yeah, so we actually did want to have a left wing perspective, and we filmed with a bunch of lefties around the country.
Mm,
Um, and it just didn't work within the construct of the film. Um, um, Partly because of what I mentioned around sort of the structure of a verite film, this particular verite film, the people needed to be in better relationship with each other. They needed
mm,
to be um, sort of interacting with each other on a greater way for the narrative to make sense. We kept trying to have sort of these other storylines. What also a problem that we encountered was there was this sort of like tendency to make false comparisons between these folks without adding sort of layers of narration and further context. And
Hmm.
so what that meant is we needed to have the individuals provide their own context in some ways. And so what that led us to do to this, it was very complicated to edit, but we wanted to make sure that you could really see people saying what they're about and then having their actions immediately juxtapose those words
Yeah,
by either confirming or refuting what they're doing to their actions, right?
correct. Yeah.
And that's what the film that was like a core sort of editorial approach so that we could have do a degree of fact checking that was based on what people were actually doing. So they were almost sort of fact checking themselves because you would see them in the next scene either do what they said they were going to do or do something very different that
Hmm.
reveals something about maybe their true character. And sort of in that structure, the sort of left wing storyline, it was just like too many ideas for a brain to hold within a 2 hour film, particularly for people who think that there is an equivalency between these sort of violence that happens in different ways, right?
I personally have been involved in protest in my youth. I'm about to be 40 here. So, part of the Occupy protests or different kind of protests that take place around the country. One thing that I think is consistent, regardless of your background or beliefs, is that there's a frustration. And as much as you want to have a unified thought or movement, there's individuals that go to different extremes. And you
Yep.
capture that here as well. I'm curious because you do also capture footage at the Capitol on January 6th. Did you have any concern that you might be deemed as someone that's involved in this insurrection because you are capturing this as press and maybe how that will get spun? And like, what were your thoughts around that dynamic, like as it's happening live?
No, that's a great question. That wasn't in my mind as it happening live. Like when it's happening in the moment, like my only thought was just like, don't die and make sure the record button is always pushed and
Right,
don't accidentally turn off the camera by mistake or getting jostled around. So like
right.
that was just like all I was thinking about is like, what is the sort of subject of the frame? What is the composition of the frame? Is the record button going? And where's my producing partner? So my producing partner is also she does sound for motion picture, Rachel Falcone. So it was the two of us, and so it was always just like, okay, where
Wow.
is she? Where's the person? Is the record button going? So that was sort of the thought at the moment. Stepping back, a lot of people were like, "Oh, why weren't you picked up? Why weren't you picked up?" Like, we were journalists, sort of covering this scenario. So we didn't necessarily think that we would be the subject, be the target of an investigation. We were concerned that there could be the potential because of our level of access, and we were our no, we it's very clear that we were under surveillance because the people that we were filming were under surveillance,
Hmm.
and so we thought that there could be a possibility that maybe our footage would be subpoenaed or we would be asked to testify. That didn't happen.
Mm.
I think January 6th, I don't know if this probably isn't hyperbole, but it's probably one of the most documented crimes in history,
Sure.
so they didn't necessarily need what we had, probably.
Interesting. That's fascinating. The film ends, and it's not a spoiler because it's like you said, it's well documented. But Trump's back in office, and he ultimately pardons these insurrectionists. And this is, in my opinion, one of the first of many orders he's done to cripple justice and consequence. And I think you highlight that the way the film ends. Things have only escalated, considering the kidnapping and violence taking place by ICE. Can you speak to the correlation, if you see any, that began when you first started producing this film to where we are, half a decade later or even longer from when you first had this idea, as far as the state of the country? Is there any correlation that's built up to where we are now?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the path has been quite linear from, even if you chart it from 2008, when you start with the election of Barack Obama and just the
Yeah.
backlash to
Yeah.
a black president. And that gives the Tea Party. And with the Tea Party, you have all these sort of like anti-immigrant groups that sort of emerge post 9/11 that then sort of rebrand and represent themselves as the Tea Party. And so you have this sort of direct line where you have a certain segment of America that feels like their way of life, their cultural identity is being threatened by the sort of multicultural possibility of democracy. And so I think what we have that's new is the increasing willingness to use violence in our political system, which shouldn't necessarily be surprising to people. Like, we live in an incredibly violent society, like incredibly violent. Like, most of our news and most of our entertainment, our movies that people consume are violent movies, just on that level. And so we have this sort of like thing that happens in America that it's this American exceptionalism, that America is such an exceptional democracy, an exceptional place. That's sort of violence that is present in other sort of democratic or non-democratic segments of the world can't happen here.
Mm-hmm.
But it can happen here. It is happening here. If this was a foreign country, we would be referring to this violence as sectarian violence. That's how we
100%.
would characterize this violence. And so you see this increasing permission to use violence in political life grow. And that's the direct line. I think, on January 6th, you had, all these people who, a day later, even some of them had shirts that said Blue Lives Matter. But, for 4 hours, you're fighting the police and
Mm-hmm.
you're, acting like that's not a thing. But this is a sort of direct line that's happening. And, it's not new. America was born out of violence. The American
100%.
Revolution, was a violent act. And we had these 13 disparate places, these colonies sort of come together. And what defines us is our difference. Like, that's the sort of core tenet of American democracy, is how do you bring difference together to work together? That's like a core idea. From 2016 to 2025, you had largely non-state actors perpetrating violence. You had
Mm-hmm.
sort of like the broader movement sort of trying to advance their agenda through violence or the threat of violence. Now you have the state taking over that role. So a lot of these groups, these
Yeah.
groups that were ready to use violence to achieve their means, have sort of receded from the headlines because the state is now doing their job in a way that is completely unprecedented.
Right.
And so I think that's the trajectory, if any of that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the way, I go on LinkedIn and I see promotion to join organizations and jobs like ICE, and I can't help but think some of these people are applying or now working. That's my own personal thought behind that. But I think one thing that you touched on in that answer is that, this country was founded on violence. I mean, it's in our national anthem, right? So I completely can relate to your perspective of this country being founded on such a thing, and we shouldn't be surprised. But I'm curious, for the people that were involved in the insurrection, what has the reception of the film been on their side? Like, do they feel that they have a moment of reflection and regret, or do they seem empowered now that Trump's back in office? And I know that probably goes individual to individual, but overall, have you gotten any kind of feedback in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, the feedback that we've gotten from people individually and sort of also by reading what's happening in social media and conservative media is that people feel absolutely justified. The sort of violence was condoned, supported, and given permission. And that is dangerous, right? Like, there's been no accountability. There's been no sort of reckoning or self-awareness with, what it means to fight police for 4 or 5 hours. Um, and so it's kind of scary, where it's a scary moment for America.
Absolutely. As I watched, I couldn't help but be reminded or remember, going to high school with people with similar mindsets, and this is 20 years ago. Fast forward to present day, it's hard to find optimism considering the level of frustration by American people from all sides. That's something that seems to be a constant. Were you able, or have you been able to find any silver lining or a ray of hope upon completing your documentary?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ray of hopes. There's a couple sort of things that I look to, and it's great that you mentioned sort of Occupy Wall Street and these other protests that have happened, because I think across the board there's a growing frustration that is palpable and it's present, that understands that we live in a sort of economic and political reality where the system is rigged in favor of billionaires and corporations at the expense of working people.
Mhm.
Like, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, whether or not it's articulated in that way, there is this sentiment that's populism. This idea that there's this sort of the system is rigged against average people in favor of the billionaires and the corporations, right? And so that is something that people across the spectrum feel. Just different people are given different explanations for who is
Mhm.
responsible and what to do with that. But I think understanding the sort of underlying thing is really key to really trying to break through all of the individual isms that create all these divisions. And also on that tip, I think that one of the things that we were surprised about was that we had this perception that what's driving people to participate in some of these movements was ideological. That people had this sort of particular vision, and so that got them off their couch and is leading them to do the things they do. And that's not accurate. People are driven more for a search for community or belonging or purpose or meaning than they are ideology they might pick up along the way, and even then it's fluid and dynamic.
Right.
And I think, again, if we get at those core frustrations, that people feel isolated, people feel like they can't get ahead, like we can begin to sort of find better ways to address this sort of fundamental systemic problem in American society and in the global economy, the global society at writ large.
It's a great point. I think oftentimes, as far as ideology goes, it's not even founded in education. It's more of like a narrative that people are being fed. And, I have a hard time calling something political because I think it is quite binary. It's either you have to pick a side. It's either this or that, right? Life is much more complex than that. So I appreciate you highlighting that. You've been incredible with your time. I just have one last question that I like to ask everybody. What is an underseen film or maybe documentary that could pair well with your film that you would like to recommend for people?
Oh, that's a great question. Hmm. Um, Interesting.
And it could even be, a narrative film as well. Just something that you think more people should get their eyes on.
Well, people keep telling, and there's some letterboxed reviews about our film that's saying that like our film exists somewhere between Eddington and Civil War.
I love that. That's funny.
Uh,
Okay.
so I think that's um, I think um, there's a verite film about the election in about Bill Clinton's election that I think is interesting to revisit in relationship to our film by oh, what was it called?
The War Room,
Yes, the War Room, exactly. Yeah, it talks
1993,
about
The
sort of
War
a
Room.
Bill Clinton's sort of presidential campaign and it's sort of an inside look at sort of like the players who were sort of like part of making those decisions. And it's also a great example because you don't see the sort of ideology. There isn't, there's values, there's core values, but there isn't that sort of like perception of politics as this sort of like ideological quest, which is it's sort of become now. And it's just an interesting to sort of look at sort of what was in the firmament in 1994, 1992 when that film was made versus now.
Right, right. An incredibly important film. I think, an incredible decision by you to not have any kind of interviews outside of the people you're featuring that are on the ground. I think, as I mentioned, it makes it very nonpartisan and it's just showing you what's happening. And I think that's incredibly powerful. So again, congratulations on the film. Again, the movie is Homegrown. You can see that at homegrown.film. Make sure to check that out. Michael Premo, thank you so much for your time and, to be quite honest, putting your well-being and safety on the line to get it done. So thank you so
Thank,
much.
Thanks so much, my guy. I really appreciate your interest and your questions. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.